Veo las huellas de la gente que camina sobre la arena de un desierto desconocido. No puedo ver más que unos pies enfrente de mí, solo iluminados por la luz de la luna. Mientras cruzamos por el monte en la área sur de los Estados Unidos, solo sé que vamos cerca de llegar, pero muy lejos de donde tenemos que estar. Al terminar el plazo del camino, indicándonos qué hacer, el Coyote nos señala que tomaremos un descanso. No sé el tiempo, pero sé que es muy temprano en la mañana. Voy acompañado de mi abuelo, mi hermano y unas cuantas docenas de viajantes, migrantes en búsqueda de una nueva vida. Un futuro claro, algo prometido, pero nada seguro. El sueño americano. El año es 1999, tengo 6 años de edad y en este momento solo sé que no soy nadie más que otra persona queriendo cruzar. Soy un mojado, un inmigrante ilegal. So it's definitely been a little bit over 20 years or so since that day, since that experience of me crossing the border in 1999. And to be honest, to be really honest about it, a lot and nothing has pretty much changed since then. The only difference now is that it's actually a little bit more difficult to get across. The thing that I've actually noticed though from that whole span of almost over 20 years is that we're no longer the only group of immigrants. We never really were, but the biggest focus has always been on us, being Hispanics, being Latinos, being of different origin, but mainly south of the border. Anybody who speaks Spanish of any sort is usually prime target for immigration, and always has been for the most part ever since. Now, a lot of that I came across both growing up as well as experiences with other people, interactions. The entire time I've been in the United States has always kind of opened my eyes and baffled me a little bit, because there's a very particularly specific instance where I was thrown back when I found out that one of my school friends from the Philippines was actually an illegal immigrant. It was a little bit weird. It was a little bit just kind of concerning. It's like, because always in my life, always growing up all the way up until late middle school or so, I always thought mostly all the illegal immigrants, mostly all the people that were in the ESL class were people who spoke Spanish. And then here comes this Asian kid who speaks English and everything, but I'm still under the impression that, oh man, this guy's got papers, this guy's got his green card, he doesn't have to worry about anything. And upon further investigation, we're sitting there talking, and he reveals to me, he literally tells me, no man, I'm not a US citizen. I came here illegally way before I was born, but I've always been in the United States without even knowing it. And that surprised me. And that actually made me want to start looking for more answers and try to find out a little bit more about the immigration process, how things happen, and how is it that we're still immigrating, people are still immigrating to this country, and what other ethnic groups, what other cultures, what other people from other walks of life, other parts of the world are coming to the United States by unconventional means. And when I mean unconventional means, I mean the far off multiple ways that people stay here in this country illegally. The multiple amounts of ways that people come to this country illegally, one way or another. So that's going to be the first portion that we're going to be talking about, the immigration process. So, according to New York Bozo Goldstein, New York immigration law firm, the 3 most common ways of entering the country legally are via the southern border or by guided means. In my case, a coyote. You pay the man, he essentially gathers you and a group of however many people, and you're essentially smuggled across the border. That's pretty common. Visa overstays is the second means. Now, that's a little bit more interesting because there are a lot of people that actually come to the country, to the United States, with visas, either student visas, working visas, tourist visas, and those are common ones. I personally have not met somebody who has been here in the country with a student visa, working visa, or tourist visa and has overstayed it. But a lot of people still stay. This is one of the reports, right? And then the other one is border crossing violations. A temporary travel visa for entering the country via border crossings that allow travel in the country for a set amount of time. So these are the short-term visas. Now, in my time living in Southern California, in the border of Mexicali and Calexico, the continuous traffic on a day-to-day basis was immense. There was about 3 or 4 border crossings from between the edge of California, which was in the central California, all the way to Yuma, Arizona. These border crossings allowed people to come and go outside of the country, into the country, back and forth on a multiple daily basis. Like I said, thousands and thousands of people would enter and come back and would enter again into Mexico, back into the United States. It's a fairly common way to come in, and it's a fairly common way to be able to enter the country and to exit without little to no questions, especially when you have the permission. Now, why would somebody grant these permissions? Well, a lot of people do the same thing that they've been doing for the longest time. For the longest time, it's always been people from the border towns coming into the United States, coming to work. And the only difference that's changed between how that used to be in the early 1900s, hell, 1800s, before the actual blatant stealing of Mexican land by the United States, was that people would literally just cross the line in the sand. And people would come to the country and work on this side of the border, and then would go back and meet back with their families after that time frame, after this picking season's over, after the work had basically ended for the season, for whatever time frame it was. So up until the early 1900s, this was a fairly common practice. People don't understand that. I never knew this. So these are extra permissions that are given to people to be able to travel in and out of the country. Now, another thing that people don't realize is that people who still live on the other side of the border, who still live in Mexico, have children, have kids that are students, that are college, that are university age, that are high school age, that are elementary school age. They apply for a student visa, the authorized time frame for them to be able to come into the country, into the United States, to be able to study their classes and then come back. But their main homestead, their main place of residence is in Mexico. So that's a pretty common way people have done it. But why I'm bringing this up is that it's not to bring any attention to you. It's not to kind of highlight it. It's to kind of show that no matter what obstacle is really pretty much placed in front of us, not just as a community, not just as a Latino Hispanic community, but as creatures, as individuals, as people just wanting to progressively keep moving forward. These obstacles are still placed in our way, but yet we still find a way to be able to migrate, to be able to travel, to be able to get to where we want and how we want to get there. So when the immigration issue comes up, every single so often, I just start to think, I always think, what is it about the consistent flow of human nature that scares other people, that keeps that fear of immigration, that fear of progress, that fear of allowing people to travel? It's always interesting. It's always an interesting thing. Now, with all of this immigration, not only do people come from these countries and stay encapsulated in a frozen state. You don't just enter the country and immediately you know English. You're assimilated to whatever culture, whatever area you are. You could be up north in the Northeast, over in Maine, New York, whatever situation. You could be down south in Florida, down south in Texas. You can be in the West Coast in California. You can be in the Midwest, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, hell, Indiana, and all these places. And you're going to find all sorts of walk of people, all sorts of people in these locations. And I think the most important thing out of the fact that people migrate, that people immigrate into the country, is the biggest export from all these locations and the largest import into the United States that is not feasibly tangible is culture. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about culture when it comes to being an immigrant, because culture is the only last seed, is about the last seed that we are able to hold on to and to be able to plant wherever we begin to lay these new roots. And we let it blossom, we let it flourish, we let it grow. And once you've seen this culture grow, it expands and it goes beyond other things. It goes beyond feasible, tangible borders. It actually surpasses frontiers. Now, in this sense, culture is passing a whole different aspect, but it's still crossing all of these borders, all of these frontiers, to be able to get to where it is anywhere in the world. And I do mean anywhere in the world. So with touching on culture, a lot of the time with culture, my culture is everywhere. Being Hispano, being a Mexican, my culture is everywhere in the United States. And it's been prominent mainly in the West Coast, mainly in the southern United States, from Texas inboard west, and even some parts in the middle of the United States. But the Mexican culture is one of the largest assimilated cultures in the United States that I have observed, right next to Chinese culture, Japanese culture, and African American culture. These are the largest spans and largest communities in the United States. Now, there will always be little subsections of every single one of these cultures. But to bring up, these are one of the largest groups that I have ever known. In the Northeast, in the New York area, in the New Jersey area, things like that, a lot of it is Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Haitian. You have a lot of Caribbean culture. Same thing with the southern areas of Florida, Louisiana, Missouri, Mississippi. A lot of people from the Caribbean that speak Spanish, but it's a whole different set of cultures. And every single culture isn't necessarily restricted to the area, but it's a lot more prominent to every specific area in the United States. Now, a lot of these cultures that pop out, a lot of these cultures that are large in numbers, are there because of the mass migrations. This is generations upon generations upon generations of people settling down, making homesteads in these locations, in these places that they have never been before. That all they know is that it's always been the American dream. Another thing that surprises me about how culture spreads very, very uniquely is how every single generation adapts to culture very differently. There's a lot of things that point, from my personal experience, the shift and the change in how Hispanic and Latino culture has advanced in its own way. A lot of the more commonly recognized and known parts of our culture are obviously mariachi, salsa, cumbia, banda, right? Taco stands everywhere. You're always going to have the Mexican restaurant wherever it is. Quesadillas here, Cinco de Mayo, all that stuff. Other ones known that derive from all of that are lowrider, Chicano culture, those are other parts of the Hispanic Latino culture that happened out of what our parents brought here along with us. Same thing with a lot of the Caribbean locations. They brought all of these practices. We've all brought all of these practices and all of these cultures, all of these systems of beliefs, systems of rules from where we originally are from, and we've reestablished them in the location where we're at. And I find it interesting that even outside of the United States, from personal experience, from what I've been able to hear and see from my personal travels, is how far we have actually spread as a Mexican people. How far we've been able to spread as Hispanos. The most interesting one that I've been able to find is that the Chicano lowrider culture from Los Angeles, from Southern California, has actually expanded all the way to Japan. There is an entire subsection of Japanese people who listen to oldies, who listen to rap, Chicano rap, who have made their own Chicano conglomerates of artists, of rappers, of producers, of entrepreneurs, enthusiasts, influencers of every single kind. Now that's surprising. There's a whole entire lowrider scene, Chicano lowrider scene in Japan. That's crazy. And it surprises me that us coming in as illegals into the United States, we've been able to spread outside of the walls, outside of the borders of the United States. That's crazy as hell. Another thing that I've discovered too in my travels from the United States is in Ireland. It's been a small section, but we ran into a group of, I would say, either Argentinian or Ecuadorian family that was running a Mexican restaurant. But when me and my buddies, we went into the restaurant, we didn't expect to see what we saw. But it was to the teeth, mariachi this, sarape that. They had the Mexican flag plastered all over it. They had the colors of a lot of the artisanal clothing, dresses, attire, music, even the food. Although the food was a little bit off, the intent was there. The intent was there that it was a Mexican restaurant. And although some people might call that cultural appropriation, because they weren't Mexican, the intent to establish our side of the culture, the Mexican culture in Ireland, a predominantly white country, the Anglo-Saxons, these other sections of people, these other tribes that eventually evolved into the Irish, for them to be able to try to establish a restaurant there and still be, I guess, successful, it just fascinated me. I wasn't insulted. In fact, I was actually honored to have been across the world and see this, a small little slice of my own culture outside of the United States, in Europe. Now, when it comes to people and culture, people are the first to be able to make things happen, spread culture, make things flourish. And without people, without immigration, regardless, forget about the fact whether it's legal or illegal, immigration is a common process. The act of emigrating from your own personal country, from what you called home, is a hard process. And for people to move on from these locations and try to establish themselves anywhere else is always going to be a very difficult thing. A lot of things that people have also done is we've subverted expectations. As immigrants, we've established ourselves, not only as immigrants, we've established ourselves as a force to be able to take over, to be able to compete with what is considered the norm. I'm going to be talking about these people in different sections and different parts that they've made influences that to this day, now that I realize that these people have some sort of origin in the Hispano, in the Latino culture, that makes me proud to recognize, man, we are making a big difference. So there's probably a lot to be said about influences that are from the Hispano Latin community. And a lot of those influences actually stand out. They definitely stand out in light of a lot of ways. But not for the fact that they're actually Latino or Hispanic. It's actually out of the fact that they're discovered to be Latino, Hispano, of any kind of sort. So a lot of these influences, I mean, we already know the obvious ones. The most recent ones that I can think of from growing up was always Pitbull, Jennifer Lopez, Jenny Rivera. I mean, even though she did sing corridos and banda and everything, she was actually born in LA. Interesting enough. A lot of the influences we grew up with, including from them, was Lil Rob, Mr. Capone, NB Riders. Like all of these out of nowhere kind of artists. But it was always centered around our time frame. Just kind of how, like, growing up during the early 90s, early 80s, a lot of the Latino and Hispanic community was circling around Marc Anthony. So a little bit with all these influences is the kind of effect that they had on our community and our culture. So in the early 90s, it was very rare to even see a person of different descent. I mean, they were out there. Obviously, you can always tell from like newsreels and other certain shows that the Hispano Latino community was out there doing work. They were in sitcoms. They were in leading roles of talk shows and everything. But the thing was that you never saw anybody who genuinely, and I do mean genuinely, truly identified as somebody who was from the Hispano-Latino culture, the Hispano-Latino community. And I'll even put an example of this. Although Puerto Rico is one of the largest mixed countries that speak Spanish, along with Mexico, they're actually still one of the largest mixed speaking countries in the world. You rarely see a lot of the people that are in hue, in tone, a little bit darker. It's really rare. And this example comes to me because one of the two famous shows that I grew up watching was Cristina and Don Francisco with Sábado Gigante. So those shows, and I'm not trying to say anything about the culture or anything, but like just the way that it was greatly accepted. But you never really saw anybody who wasn't of a browner shade, to say it the least, that was on television. It was always somebody with fairer skin, a little bit more white, somewhat Caucasian features. And growing up, I saw all of this. So that was one of the secondary effects. But the primary effect was we really didn't have anybody to look up to. I never really saw anybody who I could look up to and say, man, you know what, that brown person, that brown individual, this brown artist, actor, is actually of Hispanic, Latino descent. This is somebody I can identify with. He didn't have it. That's the first effect. The secondary effect is always going to be, you're always going to be looking for a secondary way to be able to identify with your own culture outside of your own culture. I think that's a lot of ways that why, even though we did have influences, and there are still influences out there, the influences that are displayed to us, that are shown to us on a daily basis growing up, for our, at least I can say part of my generation, part of the people I grew up with, were all fair-skinned and whiter looking, Caucasian looking. And anybody, like I said, with my complexion would look outside and try to find a different person to try to relate to. And that's part of what actually made me want to gravitate to a whole different side of culture, which I can definitely attest to a lot of people that I know that gravitated to the African American culture, the hip hop culture, even the rock culture. Me growing up, I loved rock and roll. Rock and roll was life. Rock and roll was everything. But as I started to get my own personal style, as I started to decide what I wanted to kind of express myself with and how I wanted to express myself, I gravitated a little bit more towards the hip hop culture. And in that, I actually ended up discovering the actual roots of Chicano culture, the Cholo style, the lowriders, the hoopties, the murals, the graffiti, and this is a lot of the effect that kind of this is a lot of the effect that plays into the younger generations, and it will always be like this with every single younger generation, because that effect on us growing up, because of the lack of these influences, not that there weren't none, but the lack of influences that we could honestly relate to were so little, we gravitated to the nearest thing. And what is one of the nearest things that we always gravitated to? Well, it was always the gangster, it was the cholo, it was always the subculture, the ones that we knew weren't understood, just like we weren't being understood. So that's where we graduated. That's where we gravitated to. And in our graduation, we essentially kept fulfilling that role of continuing a next generation of the same people. Now, it seems a little weird talking about influences and how it just shifts over completely to how some people ended up. But it goes for a lot of cultures, it goes for a lot of communities and a lot of people. And it's even more so true nowadays, because now we see the true effect of what's actually happening with the influences. Now we actually do see people of our culture, of our hue, of our skin tone, making it big, being influential, being good people. But that's actually a downfall, because in some of the ways that some of these influences that we are advancing in have slowly become our downfall. They keep influencing that get easy money, get rich quick scheme, the fast rise to fame, and it's a continuous cycle. And it's still, even because it's been the perpetual cycle of how we grew up. Now we're influencing the next generation. The next generation is taking what we have done, what we have said, because of what we learned of how we took what was said and what we saw, and they're doing the exact same thing. So although a lack of influences is good, a lack of influences is always going to be bad, and even an abundance of influences is going to be a double-edged sword, because some of these, like I said, some of these influencers now, some of the people that we can technically look up to, they're kind of still stuck in that same boat, where we're always looking for the get rich quick scheme. We're always looking for that acceptance and community in wherever we can find it. And we haven't advanced past that. And every single culture has that. Every single community has that. We're just continuously perpetuating that. And it's just a little bit difficult to see. But with that too, there's also the inverse. There's also the opposite side of noteworthy people, noteworthy causes, the influences that are actually out there making a difference for us. Now, like I said, growing up watching Cristina, Don Francisco, La Señorita Laura, because everybody saw that one, La Señorita Laura, and everything on Telemundo, Univision, Telefutura, Galavisión, all of these channels, I always saw something. I always saw these influences. But one of the influences that expanded me a little bit more was actually going to the theater, watching movies, and then eventually discovering that some of these movies that I watched that were obviously Hollywoodized, were actually put together in a high production value in the United States, had Hispano-Latino cultures years later. One of the most interesting stories was that I read about a man of about 45 when the first Star Wars story came out. This was the new trilogy, prequel, sequels, however you want to call it, of the Star Wars stories, the Rogue One, where Diego Luna actually appeared. And I still remember reading the story about this man in his 40s who actually went to go see Rogue One because his daughter took him to go see Rogue One. And he was so surprised. He was so infatuated and so surprised and so proud that he actually heard a very distinct accent, and it was Mexican, in the theater for this character in a big screen production that he had not seen before, that he didn't think was going to have somebody that represented him. And this actor, like I said, was Diego Luna. Now, Diego Luna had already been in other movies. He's known for Narcos. He's known for Motorcycle Diaries. He's known for a lot of movies outside of the United States, but they're all indie hits. They're all documentaries. They're all other types of themed films. Like I said, we knew him growing up in Mexico as the guy from Y Tu Mamá También. That was his thing. That was a great movie. And I always knew him from the Motorcycle Diaries when he represented Che Guevara, and Gael Barnel Garcia also was his co-star. They co-starred in the movie itself. But like I said, seeing this man and reading this story about the realization about how we've actually gone this far into Hollywood, just even it brought a little bit of heart emotion to me, because now we're actually being represented for who we were. This man wasn't putting on an act. He was an actor, obviously. He's an actor. He's paid to play a role. But he wasn't putting up an act of his culture. He was playing it, and he was delivering his lines as a true representative of my culture, of being a Mexican. Another one well-known that I had seen and had never really recognized was Oscar Isaac. Oscar Isaac is a great actor, and he's been in so many movies where you would have never thought it's like that he would have been represented. And although he's not Mexican, he's a part of the Hispano Latino culture, and he's a great representation of us. Yes, he is partially in lighter tone, but whenever it comes to the fact and the culture of how he wants to represent himself, he represents his culture. When they did the first sequel for episode 7, he even said that his home planet of Endor basically reminded him of his Peruvian roots. And if I'm wrong, then that's fine. Correct me, please. But he did say that his native dialect of Spanish was like equating it to it being the native dialect of Endor. So it's fascinating how many years we've gone without influences, and then wherever else we look, we find other influences. We find people we can look up to, people who can represent us in a great way. Like I said, these are just a few examples of people, but they're out there. They're out there making noteworthy changes to the landscape of Hollywood. The general Hollywoodization, the general status quo of what it means to be an actor in a Hollywood production. Now, finally coming back full circle and making all of this make sense is that we have gone through so many frontiers. We have crossed so many borders. We have made it through every single aspect of what is deemed the normal, and we have surpassed it in a visual representation, in a physical representation, in an influential way that is just outstanding. It's incredible. It's almost unbelievable that in such a short time frame, we've been able to change the entire landscape of how a lot of the culture, a lot of our media, our creations are actually digested. And I'll say that in a lot of ways because music is one of those greatest fronts that I never truly thought we would be able to surpass on such a great scale. Film has been one of the greatest ones that we've also been able to scale, not just as a Mexican, in total as the Hispano-Latino community. Art is always going to be a very subjective one, but a lot of the art influences that come together and create these things and surpass all these structures, these possibly physical borders, it still becomes very incredible. And along with that, there's also other noteworthy causes that we've been able to surpass. We as a community have endured a lot of things as well, and we're coming together slowly, where a lot of the noteworthy causes that represent us nowadays are incredible. One of the more well-known ones recently is for the street vendors, especially in light of what's been happening with the recent attacks, both for us and the Asian community, especially with the Black Lives Matter community, with the injustices. These noteworthy causes are not for just the betterment of our community, but for the betterment of people. We're trying to help each other out in every single way. These noteworthy causes are everything that we had been dreaming of for the longest time. The saying, "Si se puede," was coined in during the Obama administration, has been recognized due to the Obama administration. But it's actually a saying that has been around for far longer than I have been alive. And I want to bring a little bit of light into where the saying actually may have come from. And I believe it actually stems from the great Cesar Chavez, one of the greatest fighter for the civil rights movement for the Hispano-Latin community. He was the one that coined it. And with all these noteworthy causes and him coining in that term, now I can truly see and recognize that "si se puede" isn't just a term to be able to say that we're able to do it. As a hardworking, laboring force, we're able to do it. As the people who raise your kids and come here to do the dirty jobs, we can do it. As the people who take that extra initiative to be able to try to make a difference. No, it's more than that. Si se puede stems and creates and uproots itself to be able to show that we're able to do it. Si se puede, y lo hemos hecho. We have done it. We've made a difference, and we're going to keep making a difference. This is probably one of the greatest fronts that we have to be able to create a leveled unification. And when I mean one of the fronts, I mean us being able to express ourselves. Me sitting here talking and creating this podcast and being able to talk. And even though it's a little bit offshot, even though it's a little bit unput together, it's a start. It's a genuine start to something that could be bigger. Just like every single thing that has come before me. It's just another way to be able to unify us. Not just as a community, not just as Hispano Latinos of culture, but as people in general, accepting of all people in general. And these are great things and great changes that I think, and we will, and I know we will, keep making to be able to keep ourselves unified, to be able to keep making those changes, to be able to keep making those changes, to be able to be great influences and have better effects on our culture and our communities and people outside of our community who take in what we give, what we deliver, what we create, and start making all these advances and create even more advances that I may not have mentioned, that I know I didn't mention, but as well recognizing that every single one of those advances can be and possibly is a downfall, but recognizing that every single one of those downfalls is a way and another step to be able to learn, to try to maybe be better, to try to make those advances. Not just as immigrants, not just as people from a different culture, but everybody, from the origins of being a human race, from being a unified front, for finally coming together. We're gonna have our differences, we're gonna have our own opinions, but it's the little things. It's the little things that are gonna make these changes. In closing it, this is only the first episode. The reason I named the first episode Fronteras, Frontiers, is because I wanted to do a generalized highlight of a lot of what I will be talking about in the future. and a lot of what I've actually experienced. I will be touching bases, and I will be touching on a lot of these subjects, on a lot of these topics once again in future episodes. And I want this podcast to grow, to be able to reach as many people, to be able to reach anybody in my community, anybody outside of my community, anybody who feels like they need to hear that at a certain point in your life, at a certain point in time, you have felt the same way that I have, and have come to a certain realization that we need to also be making the changes. Not just observing them, not just coming to the realization that we didn't have what was able to be disposable to us to be able to make these changes. But now that we are grown up, now that we are mature, now that we are in light of that power, that we can be that change. So let's surpass all these borders. Let's surpass everything that is considered a border, because even now, to this day, I'll leave it with this. En la vida, solo hay una línea en la arena. De una manera o de otra se tiene que cruzar. Pero al final, después del tiempo, después de la marcha de la gente, no va a existir nada allí, ni la línea que algún día tú vistes que estaba ahí marcada en la arena.